But first, I want to start off tonight's show by congratulating the ABC's Patricia Karvelas for such a rigorous interview with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on Radio National. We have been highly critical on this show of the way that the ABC often appears to be lobbying for the voice, but that did not happen here. Karvelas spotted a weakness in the Prime Minister's argument, and she did not let him off the hook.
Change the topic, Prime Minister. Your new draft national platform says Labor will take steps to implement all three elements of the Uluru Statement. And the Uluru Statement isn't just about the voice, it's also about treaty and truth. Do you support a treaty, Prime Minister?
Look, what is before the Australian people is a referendum which is about voice, which is the first part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
That's right. It's the first part.
Recognition, it's about listening, and it's about better results. And there's a couple of stories today, one of which is a rather bizarre one, goes back to 1986. Treaty is currently being negotiated in Queensland with legislation.
Now, that exchange is the ABC at its strongest. You don't have to be anti-voice to have an adversarial interview when a politician is proposing a major change. That is the core function of a journalist. Labor has attempted to put the idea of treaty to one side so that voters are not spooked by what the voice could achieve. But, as Karvelas points out, treaty is a fundamental aspect of the Uluru Statement and surely one the voice will advocate for. That's why Karvelas wanted it on the record. Forget about what state leaders are doing. Does the Prime Minister support a treaty?
Do you support a treaty?
I look forward to, well, the processes are occurring.
But federally, you've committed to the Uluru Statement.
And it's not a treaty.
Perhaps potentially many treaties, right?
Yeah, that's occurring. That's like saying, do you support the sun coming up? It's occurring in Victoria, in your state, Patricia. It's occurring in Queensland. It's occurring in the Northern Territory. It is occurring in Makarrata. What that means, it's a Yolngu word, which means a coming together after conflict. People gathering together after conflict, and there has been conflict in the history of this country, and it's about reconciliation. And do I support reconciliation? Yes, I do.
And that's all fine, but he won't answer the question. Karvelas had to go back in for another attempt, and then Albanese quickly became frazzled, using the familiar line about journalists falling for no campaign spin.
Are you still committed to Commonwealth's negotiating treaties?
Patricia, well, where does it say that? It doesn't even say that in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It doesn't say that. It doesn't speak about the Commonwealth negotiating treaties. It doesn't say that, Patricia. So don't get sucked into...
I'm not sucked into anything. I just want to know what your position is.
What our position is that there will be a referendum in the last quarter of this year about recognition, about listening, and in order to get better outcomes for Indigenous Australians. That's what people will be voting for. And the fact that the No campaign wants to talk about everything but that says that they don't have any confidence in their argument.
The voice needs to be able to withstand the toughest barrage of questions. It needs to be able to last more than a century, not a single term of Parliament. Proponents of the voice should be trying to steelman the proposal and refine it based on feedback. And far too often, those asking us to reform our constitution and political structures turn on the journalists asking questions. Politicians who try to blame the media for being too mean or tough are simply being pathetic. Wanting more information and displaying a healthy degree of scepticism and curiosity is what journalists should do. And while Albanese is still refusing to directly state that he wants a treaty, it is clear that he supports the full Uluru Statement, which is his right and prerogative. But it makes these performances of verbal gymnastics on 2GB with Ben Fordham all the more puzzling.
As part of the Uluru Statement, we have a voice, we have treaty, we have truth-telling. As part of a treaty, won't there be compensation? If there is, I mean, that's not totally unexpected.
This isn't about a treaty, Ben.
But there are three parts of the Uluru Statement.
Yeah, and this is not...
So you're talking about the voice.
This is not about a treaty.
But as part of treaty, which we guess will be a following step...
This is not about a treaty.
Do you foresee that compensation would be paid?
This is not about a treaty.
Well, joining me on the show tonight is Sky News host Caroline De Russo and Sky News contributor Joe Hildebrand. Now, Joe, I've become a Patricia Karvelas fan, but as someone...
The wheel turns.
The wheel turns. Just last week we were criticising her, but fair's fair. That was a brilliant interview. And you're someone that's very pro The Voice.
Yep.
I'm curious, what do you make of the fact that now the ABC has started to pinpoint some of these inconsistencies?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, just the sort of to sort of hone in on the ABC's role in it. It's been criticised. The initial criticism of the ABC's coverage of The Voice was that it was too pro-voice, not from the conservative side of politics, but from the sort of Lydia Thorpe crazy left-wing outlier side of politics. Said The Voice has to be killed off because it's not radical enough, because it doesn't involve a treaty directly, because it's not going to result in a black sovereign nation rising up Phoenix-like from the ashes of colonial imperialism. So I found that very, very funny. And I think, and I believe poor old PK was directly targeted by Lydia as well when she had her things to say. Now, of course, the pendulum has swung, strangely enough, back to the same position where they're anti-The Voice, but raising the concerns that some on the more conservative side have about the nature of a treaty and whether The Voice will lead to a treaty, which, in theory, Lydia Thorpe should be very happy about. She should say, oh, it's great, The Voice and the treaty, they are the same thing after all.
It makes it confusing that she wouldn't be for it then, if that would be the logic. Do you think that is the logical...
To be honest, I'm not sure if there's a great deal of logic in this debate or in the campaign more generally. I am a fervent yes supporter, albeit a somewhat despondent one at times, because there's just been a lack of clarity around the yes campaign. And there's clearly, as we've seen just from the fallout from the sort of vaguely contradictory positions, not entirely contradictory, but vaguely contradictory positions that we've seen from people right across the yes campaign. So you've got some people saying it's got nothing to do with the treaty. Then there were people, people I really respect and love, who suddenly writing pieces saying, actually, a treaty's not a bad idea, So, all right, so we're running this campaign, we're trying to get people to vote yes. Are we telling them it's all to do with the treaty and treaties are great, or are we telling them that it's nothing to do with the treaty and that's just a red herring from the no campaign? Because at the moment, those two parallel arguments are both being advanced. Now, the truth is, as the PM rightly said, there is no treaty. There are lots of little treaties, or there's no big one treaty that Australia can sign with Aboriginal people, because Aboriginal people aren't a single homogenous unit. They're completely different. There's 150 different tribes, I think, in Queensland alone, for example. So all the different states and territories, or most of them anyway, I think Queensland, Victoria, South Australia and the NT, I think, from memory, don't judge me on that, are currently negotiating all these little treaties with individual tribes. And what those treaties actually produce is the important thing, not whether there's a treaty or not. So I'm reminded of this great interview that Bob Dylan did in the 60s, I think, with Playboy magazine, where they challenged him. It was just after he'd gone electric, and all the hippies and all the folkies were all upset that he'd sold out to the man. And someone said, do you believe in the cause of peace? And Bob Dylan said, the cause of peace? That's like saying, do I believe in the hunk of butter? Are you asking me about the hunk, or are you asking me about the butter? So, you can have, if there's a treaty that just says, I want to be your friend, oh great, I want to be your friend, thank you very much. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that whatsoever. That is reconciliation. If there's a treaty that says, here you go, here's Rio Tinto, well then obviously some people are going to have concerns with that. So it's the outcome. A treaty in and of itself is no more important than a tube that can carry water or rat poison.
Yeah, Caroline, I think the thing that I found really interesting about that interview with Karvelas was that Albo slipped up a little bit when he started to get frazzled and said, well, you're just falling for these tricks. And Karvelas did not like that. And I do think it was unfair, because she wasn't doing that. She was asking quite legitimate questions. We saw him do the same thing to Ben Fordham, though, when he said, Ben Fordham, you're reading straight out of a no pamphlet. People can see through that, can't they?
Of course they can. And we discussed the Ben Fordham interview the last time I was on the show, and we talked about how having a crack in that way is about trying to undermine credibility of the question rather than the substance of the argument. And that was exactly the same MO that the Prime Minister used in relation to Patricia Karvelas in this interview. The fact of the matter is, Albo spent 10 years in opposition, talking to the media and not being really asked very difficult questions at all. So I don't think he's particularly match fit. And so we've seen this, and we've seen, I think it was Phil Curry who reported on this, about how the Prime Minister doesn't do as many press conferences as the former government did, and that when you ask him questions that he doesn't want to answer, he gets a tanty. So, look, I think, you know, you want the top job. Unfortunately, that there comes with some pressure testing, and I suggest you get match fit.
And also, Caroline, I'm interested in your thoughts on the PR strategy with The Voice. As Joe said, the details appear to be part of an issue with voters, where they're not quite sure what they're getting. Do you think that this treaty argument, are you for it or against it? Do you think that's going to hurt the Yes campaign if they can't specifically outline what will happen?
I think it just creates additional uncertainty. And the fact of the matter is that the Uluru Statement contains 3 parts. And so either the voice is the entree or the voice is not the entree. And the Australian people, they deserve to know whether it is or it isn't. The fact that no one wants to ask a direct question on this is problematic, because ultimately when you change the Constitution, this is not the change for a very short period of time. This here is a change that is potentially going to impact for hundreds of years. So then, yes, the rest of the Uluru Statement is relevant because we are talking about the future. This is a change about the future, not just the future this term or next term, but, you know, 100 years' time. So the Australian people do deserve to know. And the fact of the matter is that the reason this government and the Yes campaign don't want to give clarity on this is because they know that while the electorate is happy for there to potentially be an advisory body that doesn't necessarily have teeth, whether the electorate is also happy with something like a treaty, I think you'll find that then, you know, in principle support for The Voice would probably drop off pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens.